Welcome to Arth Unearth. We are your hosts, Akash and Ruchir.
Arth Unearth is a fortnightly podcast where we deconstruct themes from movies and TV shows to discuss the economics, politics, and science behind it. In this episode, we sit down with Professor Chinmay Tumbe, who teaches economics at IIM Ahmedabad, to discuss the viral Bhojpuri rap song Bambai Mein Kaaba. Professor Tumbe's research revolves around the history and economics of migration and urban development, and he is also the author of the critically acclaimed book India Moving: A History of Migration.
In our conversation with him, we deconstruct a variety of things, using the song as a starting point. Is migration a problem that needs to be checked? Is it a choice for migrant workers? Are the migrants better off than those who stay back in the village? Does caste go away when people move to cities? How did the lockdown impact migrant workers? Does India need new cities? And if yes, how would they come up? Does the son of the soil sentiment stoked by nativists, is it legitimate or is it not so? Listen to our discussion with Professor Chinmay and find out.
Professor Chinmay teaches economics at IIM Ahmedabad. He's very popular on campus for his course on Hitchhiker's Guide to Business and Economics across 5 centuries. Professor Chinmay was also a visiting scholar in business history at the Harvard Business School during 2018. His research spans across the interconnected areas of migration, labor, and urban economics, as well as business and economic history. Fun fact, he also loves soccer and has also captained the IIM Bangalore team during his time as a PhD student there. He has also written a highly acclaimed book, India Moving: A History of Migration, which was published by Penguin. The book covers a lot of what we are going to talk about today and much more. Definitely check it out. It's available on almost all major e-commerce platforms like Amazon and Flipkart. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
Thank you for having me over.
Sure.
So today we are discussing this Bhojpuri rap song called Bambai Mein Kaaba. It went viral on YouTube last month. It's sung and performed by Manoj Bajpayee, who is one of my favorite actors personally, and coincidentally happens to be somebody from a very similar background and also from the same district, Champaran. Now, the music video is directed by Article 15 fame, Anubhav Sinha. The lyrics are by Dr. Sagar, who is a JNU alumnus, and the music is by Anurag Saikia, who has been up to some real good stuff lately, including the theme song of Panchayat. That was a show that we talked about in our first episode.
All right. So let's start with the fundamental question that the song asks, although it's a rhetorical one. Mumbai Mein Kaaba. So what's there in Mumbai or in any other metro city for that matter which makes people migrate? So what do you think why people do it? Do people do it out of choice?
It's of course a big question. I'll start on a lighter note. Bombay mein hai Kaaba, and of course all the Maharashtrians had a very simple answer. They said vada pav. As simple as that. And people come to Bombay because of great food in Bombay. But of course, I mean the song, and brings out very powerfully the concerns of migrant workers, which was very unfortunate earlier this year. Such a big crisis. It really exposed the underbelly of India in a very stark manner. Do people migrate out of choice? Yes, people do migrate out of choice. In this particular, case, of course, there are instances of migration not out of choice in a very stark manner. Whether you're talking of exodus, displacement like partition, Rohingyas fleeing, Burma, or Kashmiri Pandits fleeing Kashmir, and so on, right? So there are instances of forced evictions. We won't go into that. I mean, what the song is talking about really is this class of migrant workers. And are they moving out of choice? And, at one level, obviously, you would say that, if there were enough sufficient job opportunities out there, then nobody would have to leave. And so it is precisely the lack of employment opportunities which is driving these people out. And that's, of course, true. But I think it's slightly a bit more also in the sense that, even if things were very fine in a variety of other ways, there is a certain level of peer psychology, let's call it peer pressure, of leaving the village to see the big city. And that's at a very psychological level. This is an age group between 15 and 20 where people grow up in many of these migrant clusters, not just in India, around the world, where they see everyone around them migrating. So there's a history to this. And so then it's not so much of a choice per se, it's a lot of peer pressure. And maybe we can ask Akash, how did he reach Madras, in the sense there is this idea. If you grow up in the Konkan in Maharashtra or in Bihar, these are places known with mass migration history spanning more than a century. It's not just one generation or two generations. And in these places, if you grow up, you're expected to move. There's also an expectation of moving. So it's both. Are people moving out of choice? To a certain extent, no. But in the case of most migrant workers moving from Bihar to outside, yes, this is a classic thing in sociology about what we call as structure and agency. There are structural forces at work that are leading to these migration, but there is also, I would also give a lot of agency. A lot of people are moving to see Bombay. A lot of people are moving, because they've heard about potential freedom from the family, potential freedom from caste, potential. This is also an age group where people want to try out, new relationships. So there are a lot of things driving this first migration. For some it works, for some it doesn't, and we talk about that later. But I think that's how I see this whole nature of choice.
So to answer that personal question, basically, there was definitely there was nothing that I could say on I didn't have an option of sorts, but again that comes back to choice, because I did have a choice of migrating. I did have the social capital to move to Delhi to do my high school, like 11th and 12th standard, and then basically for briefly to the US and then back to Chennai. There are no good educational institutions around, there are no job opportunities around, so that's definitely there. Not migrating means being stuck here in a job which is definitely underpaying compared to what happens when you move. So I think that's definitely there. Now basically coming to this song, the narrator depicts his home back in the village, and I think he does it in a very romanticized manner. It's almost reminiscent to me of Gandhi's view of villages as opposed to that of Ambedkar, although he does bring in caste and class atrocities factor later on. It also makes it confusing because he's from a landowning class in the village, as he says that in the song, that his house is itself situated in this land which is more than two bighas. Bigha is a local unit of measurement here. So based on this, let's discuss a few key things here. What do you think of caste and class atrocities in villages versus that in cities? How does this change when you move from a village to a city? I remember this example about Bombay local train and how nobody can, find out which caste you are from in a Bombay local train. So how do you see it, Chinmay?
Yeah, that's the classic example. Norms of untouchability are vanish in a tightly jam-packed Bombay local train. But it's not, of course, that caste dissolves in a city. You have to always talk, when we talk of rural, urban, and so on, it's always in relative terms. And so I will stick out my neck and say that norms on caste, atrocities, etc., are much, much more milder in cities than in villages, right? And in fact, India's paradox is if you see the actual migration patterns in India, you would think that the poorest of the poor, the sort of people belong to scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, should be the first guys to leave. But actually, that's not the case. And as you pointed out, even in this song, the person who's singing has some land back home. In fact, the Bihari migrant worker in Bombay who's staying for 10 months and then going back for 2 months and so on. That's the typical Bihari migrant worker in Bombay is not the poorest of the poor from the village that he's coming, for the simple reason that migration also involves certain transaction costs. So those who can move, it's one is about choice, but it's also the case that those who can move and stay in Bombay for about 10 months in a year do have some social and economic capital to start off with. Right? It's the same as in international migration. The guys going from Kerala to the Gulf are not the poorest people from Kerala, though they would benefit the most. Why? Because you need to pay about 1 lakh rupees for the agent to get you the visa and cover all the transaction costs. And so there is a transaction cost in moving, and that is why actually, though the lowest caste ranking caste of India would be, they would gain the most from moving in some sense. They actually don't move, or they can't move for very long durations. They move, of course, what we call as seasonal, very short-term migrations. But because there's simply not enough networks, so you can't live with your chacha because you don't have a chacha in the city. So that particular network you don't have, and hence your cost of accommodation is higher. Whereas the average person from, say, the upper class, middle to upper class Bihari migrant worker has this powerful social network that subsidizes accommodation in the city that basically also enables you to find a job in the city. These are employment networks which are created and so on. So, if you look at India's migration pattern, there are two clear opposing things. The poorest of the poor, the landless, overrepresented by scheduled caste, scheduled tribes in India, are overrepresented in particular kinds of migration streams, what we call as short-term seasonal. Whereas what the song is really describing is the long-term circular migrant worker. The person who's away from his family for long periods of time and so on, who's left his wife and kids back home. This is this, typical Bihari male migrant worker. So it's not just caste class, but also gendered here. And that is why, I feel the song actually captures quite well what is actually happening from Bihar. And that is the poorest of the poor actually are left back in Bihar, and they are not able to move because they are too poor to move, so to speak. And then that leads us to a greater question, because the song overall is saying that things are not great, and things are not great. If things are not great for these middle to upper class or upper class migrant workers, then you can only imagine the condition of those at the lower end. But your most substantial question, are cities better? I would say yes. It does dissolve caste identities to a certain extent. It does. I mean, think of residential segregation. There's a study now from IIM Bangalore which shows very stark residential segregation in cities. But the fact is, rural India, you're staring at 100% segregation. You walk into the average village in India, and it is just completely segregated on caste. There are particular hamlets where only one caste lives, but that's pretty much the average Indian village. And you have maps to show this. In the city, in a slum, it's a bit different. It is, of course, overrepresented by certain castes and communities, but there's a much more wider exposure, right? And so that is why it is not the same, for sure. And that is why Ambedkar had such a positive view on rural to urban migration, saying this is the best way to move up. And Gandhi was coming from this idea of living in villages, precisely from this very pristine environmentalist kind of view. That is why I go and live in a congested city. And like the song celebrates, this idea of open fields, air, there's this notion of better quality of natural surroundings. That's the fundamental difference between Gandhi. So what Ambedkar is stressing is on, anonymity, driving upward mobility, and Gandhi is emphasizing on living a clean life. So the emphasis there is again on cleanliness of resources, purity, and stuff like that. Though, of course, I should add that Gandhi himself was very clear that if there are caste atrocities, people should leave the village. So in my book, I also quote Gandhi on that. So it's not that Gandhi had this complete romanticization. He also acknowledged that people should. But these are clearly two very, very different strands of thought. And today, you would say that now that the environmentalists movement is so strong and so valid with the evidence on climate change, that the Gandhian sort of notion is making a comeback. But whereas I would still argue, between these two, if you ask me what position I take, I would argue for a more Ambedkar position. Yeah.
So, sir,
So basically that came off as a surprise to me as well when I read that excerpt, that quote from Gandhi on whether when there's caste violence, Dalits should also move out of the village.
Yes.
So that was not something that I had expected. But when we talk about this Gandhian notion versus this Ambedkarite notion of villages and cities, there's another thing when you bring in the environmentalist approach that compact cities which have higher density do much better for the environment, because then you can have this forest land remaining, and you can have more green cover if you have more compact cities. So that's something which I think needs to also be looked at.
Absolutely, yeah. The classic example is this difference between, if I'm not mistaken, Barcelona in Spain and the city in Texas, Houston, if I'm not mistaken. And believe it or not, the same number of people in Houston and Barcelona, if I'm not mistaken. Barcelona is half its size in terms of the footprint. So we say Barcelona is a much more compact city than Houston. Because the classic American city is like one of urban sprawl. And not surprisingly, same number of people, but Barcelona's carbon footprint is far, far lower. Right? And so this idea that cities necessarily are, environmentally taxing, obviously they are. but you can make good cities which are not very environmentally taxing. And I think that's really, I mean, that's where the focus should be, rather than on trying to make people stay in the villages, because I don't think that's a very sustainable. I mean, there's one sustainability angle from the environment perspective, but there's also another sustainability perspective from a livelihood perspective. And from a livelihood perspective, if you have the bulk of your workforce in agriculture, there is no society on earth which has shown that you can be materially prosperous and have, say, 70% of the population agriculture. It has never happened. So that's one of the few regularities in economics, that as countries grow richer, the share of population in agriculture typically falls. So we have to move to more sustainable cities, rather than focusing on, because there's only that much that agriculture can sort of absorb.
Yeah, definitely. So that again brings me to this thing where they talk about, agriculture and these green farms and back in the village, and there's definitely a romanticization of that particular aspect of a village as well. And as you talked about, research does show, that even most farmers in the country either don't want to continue with farming, or at least they don't want their children to go into farming. We see that the proportion of agriculture's contribution to the GDP is falling, while we still have a lot of people who are stuck in that sector. So, what do you think of this scenario, and how do we change it? One thing that comes to my mind is that we still have land controls, so a farmer cannot sell his land, his or her land, to anybody who is not a farmer. And basically middlemen try to benefit out of it, and they buy that agricultural land, get its label changed to industrial land or something else, and are able to sell it off for a more expensive price. And I think this again comes from a hypocrisy where we're not giving this freedom to farmers to exit that sector.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there are a lot of things in what you're saying. Well, let me start by saying, look at the evidence within India. I'm in the state of Gujarat. You look at Maharashtra. You look at Kerala. You look at Tamil Nadu. These are states which are making this transition fairly fast now. That is, I think all these states are either, they're very close to being more urban than rural. Right? We're talking about 40 to 50% kind of urban. Whereas, in the case of Bihar, UP, and so on, you're talking of urbanization rates in the like 20s or even lesser than that. So there's fundamental difference, and so that clearly shows that as you grow richer, people are making this move out of agriculture. So that's fundamental. Now, what's the best way to do it? One way is moving out of agriculture to cities in urban jobs, and another model is moving out of agriculture but staying in rural areas. So what we call as diversification to non-farm rural sector. And in India, actually, both are happening. People are moving to cities, and people are moving. In fact, people are not moving to cities in India as much as, say, people are moving in China. China had this massive urbanization in the last 30 years. The biggest urbanization ever, which took place in the world, was literally hundreds of millions of people moving from farms to cities in China. We've not done that, but we have seen diversification. People are moving away from farms. So what does that mean? So, for example, you're a farmer, now you're at a mobile repair shop, which is a classic vocational employment in villages. You're running a mobile repair shop in a village. So that's a transition from a farming job to a non-farm job. Now, India's challenge is to create as many jobs as possible in the non-agri sector. Now, this could be in cities or this could be even in rural areas. Either way. Why? Because this is going to get you more money, as simple as that. So while we say that, what should we be doing for rural development, urban development, I think historically, a lot of people never understood that, moving people out of agriculture is not, I mean, obviously not by killing farmers and so on. It is basically by having enough of employment opportunity outside. And of course, you see the aspirations. You see when farmers themselves get rich, they don't they don't want their kids to, they want to own the land, and it becomes a status issue. It becomes a sort of or a farmhouse, right? So you move to the nearest town and city, and then you still maintain your ancestral property, but you convert it into a farmhouse. So you kind of keep a leg in both places. But your thing about land markets, so this is a good question. If we had very liquid land markets, would we see more urbanization or more diversification away from agriculture? I don't know how much it might matter, because one of the things I found in my research is a very close attachment to land, right? Ancestral land in particular. And so you look at the Konkan, and I trace some ancestry out there in Maharashtra. Again, very similar to Bihar, mass migration for hundreds or more than 100 years. People very rarely have sold land, right? And this is not just because there's no law, it's because people, even who have a base in Bombay, want to have that touch, that ancestral touch. And often a very strong cultural notion that when we die, our ashes should be, spread on our fields, or we should die in our fields, so we might spend our whole life outside, but we'll die back on our fields. So I think there are some cultural notions in India with a very strong attachment to land, which is also one of the reasons why migration is so circular in the first place, and which is why people usually don't hang on, sell off land. Now you see what's happening in India. Population is rising, same land. So what we call as, a lot of the land holding size in India is getting smaller and smaller. But still, people are not selling the land. Right? And in a lot of these migration economies, which are based on remittances, eventually the people stop investing in improving productivity of agriculture because they're getting the money from Bombay in this particular, as the song says. But what they want the land for is the kind of a status issue, and again, to as a place where the family will meet. So the land takes on a very different meaning. The land does not. I think it reduces its economic significance, but the land always retains some sort of a social significance, for the family. That's how I look at it. So it's not very clear to me if land markets are made more liquid, whether there will be more, sales in the land markets. Because I think there's a natural propensity for people to be very attached to their land. Yeah.
That's true. Actually, we've seen. I mean, Bihar. We also see that people who go to Gulf countries or to Mumbai for employment, they end up buying land back in their villages. Also, that's also happening, and that's not just because of status. Definitely because of status, of course, but also because they think of real estate as a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, and that is the whole
So that
psychology
has.
of the migrant worker. To go to Bombay, the whole objective is saving money so that you can build a nice big house, or have a nice or invest in real estate back home. There's actually very little investment in Bombay per se. So unless, of course, there are some Bihari migrants who make the switch from Bihar to Bombay permanently, right? And so there is a, what, let's call it, a Bhojpuri diaspora in Bombay as well. But that's very minuscule. Most Bihari migrants who have gone to Bombay in the last 100 years have gone back to Bihar. And I would say, of course, a lot of them don't make it big. Some of them make it big in Bombay, but a lot of them earn enough so that they can live their retirement off in relative peace. So that's a strategy. In my book, I have this cartoon of R.K. Lakshman of this like a slum-looking area, and this one, it says, there's one house in the middle, which is like a palatial house in the middle of the slum, and there's a person talking to each other saying, that fellow's gone, that's an NRI who's gone to the Gulf and back. So this is the classic response. Especially if you go in Kerala, you can make out, the freshly painted houses are the ones where people have gone to the Gulf. Because the first thing you do is, even if you're a complete failure abroad, you have to show off that, you've done well. And that's an important, again, very important part of the migrant psychology, that people who migrate, even if they're not doing well, they have to maintain a status that they're doing well, right? And so there's an interesting sort of economy of deception, if you want to call it, where people lie about what jobs they actually have. And there are movies on this. See Indians working in New York as cabbies, but saying, and they were actually, they had top-notch degrees and so on, but they don't make it big, and then they're sort of cab drivers. But when they come back to India, they don't say they're cab drivers. They lie about it. And I think that's very common phenomenon in migration that you get.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we could have an episode on movies that capture this, right? So
Yeah.
you mentioned that a lot of the migrants that come back from international who are international migrants have economic savings that they invest back in their homes, right? So, but in the book, you also mentioned about the short-term seasonal migration streams and how there's almost no economic returns on this particular stream of migration. And you said that the motive behind it is somewhat of a coping mechanism. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so these are the worst kinds of migrations, in the sense there's very little upward mobility. So for example, this Manoj Bajpayee song, which very nicely captures a lot of elements of migration. I do think, however, that in these migrations, the average migrant worker is not getting worse off. the conditions of living are atrocious, and we'll talk about that later. But they're not systematically getting worse. I mean, there is some upward mobility for the average Bihari migrant worker. Right? There's some data to suggest that. But the point is that in the short-term seasonal migrations, very little evidence of upward mobility. The upward mobility comes when they switch from short-term seasonal to more long-term circular kind of migration. So instead of 2-3 months, people now they have earned enough, so they are staying for 10 months and so on. So those are promising signs. But otherwise, in just 2-3 months, you're literally one of the reasons why you have less mobility or less upward mobility is you're completely beholden to the contractor. Note this guy, the Manoj Vajpayee song, there's no mention of the contractor. These are kit or family-based migration systems. That is, you have your uncle in Bombay and hence you're going there. But for short-term seasonal migration, you're completely beholden to a particular contractor. And the contractor is like your MyBab, right? And if the contractor is good for you. But on average, the contractor is not great. And as we saw in the migrant crisis this year, the contractor just fled. They were the first people to leave construction sites and so on. And that's how people were literally stranded in so many cities because they didn't know anybody in those cities. So they're completely at the mercy of the contractor in short-term seasonal. And the contractor does all sorts of tricks. They don't pay wages on time. They often pay wages upfront. They give you like 3 months wages upfront, part of it upfront, and then exploit you in terms of work. So there are a lot of gimmicks which happen in these kinds. And ultimately, there's very little saving. Those who do relatively well are those who are smart enough to kind of understand that this is not working and I should stay in the city for slightly more. I should diversify my job into slightly better paying job. And then over time. So of course, short-term seasonal migrations can also move for many migrants into longer term, more stable migrations. And those are more yielding. So it's not the case that, see, this is how I see. Sometimes you're locked in a particular place in a dead end kind of equilibrium. That is, there is virtually no way of upward mobility. Then you try out short-term seasonal migration, right? And there may be no upward mobility, but what moving out does is it helps you see the world a little bit, right? So you understand how the train system works, for example. You understand places. You understand how to get a job in another place. So that information is very useful as a starting point. It might not help your family. It might not even help your generation, but your kids, with your information, your kids actually might go on to better migrations. So I wouldn't say that there's no gain at all. The gain is mainly informational. And over generations, I think many places have seen seasonal migrations transform into better yielding migrations. Classic example is Ratnagiri or even Udupi. And I mentioned this in my book, which started off as very short-term seasonal migrations, became more long-term, circular, even permanent in some cases. And today, Udupi or Konkan, these are still migration places. If you look at Udupi's out-migration rate, it's pretty much similar to what you're finding in Champaran, right? But I can, you need to go to Champaran and Udupi to see the difference. So the world of a difference. Udupi is one of the richest districts of India, but still has this out-migration, and that's because of peer pressure, old history, networks, etc. But in places like Saran in Bihar, which is another district with a long out-migration, you don't see that sort of
Very true. So, you talked about the conditions and the living conditions of the migrant labor, and I think that is what a big part of the song complains about, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that is also extensively mentioned in your book. So,
Yeah.
in general, do you think that the migrants are better off than those who stay back? And do we have any data on this?
Yeah. So on average, of course, migrants, the song, of course, is lamenting. And it's also, you have to see the song in the context of the crisis of this year, right? There's absolutely no doubt that migrants are shortchanged in cities, but that does not mean that there is no gain for them. You have to see this. Let me put it this way. Let's look at Kerala, right? Before coming to Bihar. Now, if you go to Kerala, right? Kerala tops India in virtually every indicator, right? You look at Human Development Index, almost 100% literacy, etc. Yet Kerala's out-migration rate is the same as in Bihar. Now you look at labor conditions in the Gulf, not great. It's all these it's stories of slave-like conditions in certain sort of jobs and so on. And yet for 40 years you've had this mass out-migration from Kerala to the Gulf. So why are people leaving, in this particular case, God's own country as it's called, going to Gulf in often very precarious jobs. So one thing to understand is migrants are making a calculated strategy, right? So it's like you think, okay, if in 5 years they have a target. In 5 years, if I can make so much and come back, I don't mind spending those 5 years in relative misery if there's a good chance that I can live, another 20 years in reasonable comfort. Now, this might seem crazy, but this is true, and this is why you have this mass migration from Kerala, which is otherwise, such a great state, to the Gulf. It's a very similar thing from Bihar to Bombay. Now, the big thing to be said, of course, about Bombay is that Bombay has had a horrible housing market. Right? So that's the starting point. And more than 50% or something like 40 to 50% of Bombay's population now lives in slums. And Bombay is really unique. This is not the case in other cities of India. The number is much lower. Right? So, I mean, the percentage of slums in virtually every other city in India is lower. So why Bombay? So Bombay's housing market, never developed because of some very crazy laws, which were benevolent, stuff like the Urban Land Ceiling Act and so on. But it just locked up a lot of the land in the city, partly by bad laws, partly litigation, and so private housing or even public housing never really took off. And so what you have is a classic case of a supply shortage. That is, you simply don't have good supply of decent housing, and so what you have is basically these slums, right? Which is pretty much on I mean, the people occupying space and making a living. And you'll be surprised to know, of course, there are different perceptions of slums in the sense that there are also within the gradient of slums that you can have, a reasonably better off slum and a pathetic slum. And migrants often do move with some, upward mobility. They move across slums and sometimes even exit slums and move into formal housing. The broader point is, are migrants better off than when they come to rural areas? On average, yes. That's what the data suggests. But there's also you have to realize that on what indicators. And so when people move with their families, their kids are getting better education. If you look at poverty rates among migrants, it's much lower. Poverty rates are defined on consumption. So people have more money, so they're spending more and so on. But the housing quality is bad, and because of this high congestion, health takes a toll, right? And also the job site working conditions are not great. So what the evidence suggests is that while migrants do in fact better in terms of overall incomes and so on, health is something which you have to understand. In the city, you have better access to better healthcare facilities than in the village, but it's also expensive, right? And also you're more prone to getting infectious diseases in slums than say in your village. This is by the way not always true, but let's talk in terms of habit. So the evidence is not very clear on health, right? Though you might again be surprised if you look at the National Family Health Survey. It's like if you're in the average slum in India, you still do better off than a huge part of rural India, right? And that's just because you have a regular access to food, you have regular access to healthcare institutions, and so on. So if you look at anemia rates, you look at vast variety of health indicators, and I've done this. I've looked at the National Family Health Survey. It's not very clear. I can't say they're doing better, but it's not. If you thought that like what the song also suggests, this idea of leaving this beautiful land and then going and becoming less healthy, that is also not quite true in empirical terms. So there's no evidence of people getting better in terms of health, but there's no evidence of the reverse as well. But there's some evidence that people are getting better on incomes and so on, and that is why people are migrating in the first place. So on balance, it is making a positive difference, but it depends from where you're coming, how endowed you are with skills, as to who is going to make rapid gains and who is not going to make rapid gains. And as I said, coastal, Karnataka and Maharashtra have made much more gains than Bihar, for example. Both have a history of 100 years of migration, but because education in these places went up, over time, the migrants went up the value chain in terms of jobs and they started doing better. And so Bihar has to do that. And Bihar's migration story is not going to stop in 5, 10, or 15 years. It's going to go on pretty much all our lifetimes. But hopefully every generation is moving up the value chain of migration.
Yes, talking about health, you also mentioned in your book about the report of the working group on migration, and that one of the major problems they identified was that public welfare services were tied to local or domiciled areas and did not move with the migrant, right?
Absolutely, that's India's number one problem, and we now have this one nation, one ration card, which is on the cards, which is a good scheme, but that addresses only one aspect of portability. So what people who work on migration research pretty unanimous in saying that what India needs is portability of social security benefits. And the one nation, one ration is for the PDS or basically food grains and stuff. But we are talking of a much more holistic system. Everything from financial services, you should be able to access anywhere without seamlessly, from remittance services, and especially health. Right? And so that is why what I said earlier, that the evidence is not clear on health. You'll be surprised to know. So a lot of women who migrate actually go back to their villages to access healthcare facilities. Why? Because it's free. Right? So in a lot of villages, you have this Anganwadi worker, you have the Asha facilities, and so you don't have access to those services because those are services provided only at a place of birth, right? And so you don't simply locked out of India's health systems, or you can access it in the city, but you're paying a lot of money. And so why pay so much money when you can get it free back home? So we need portability. We need that migrant. So what as public policy, we should be reducing the mental load of the migrant. That is, the migrant should not think twice. Where should I access a facility? Should I go back to the gaon or should I stay in the city? Migrant should not think twice on that. The migrant should be able to access, social security at the same price or free, or however it's being pitched anywhere in India. And that is the ultimate dream with which I think a lot of people who work on migration are pushing the Indian government towards. And so that working group report pitched for that portability of social security. One nation, one ration is of course one big step towards that. But we are interested in a much more holistic portability. For that, you need interstate cooperation, and that is of course a big challenge in India. Yeah, go on.
Do you think this lack of portability is by default or by design? I mean, was it there originally to discourage migration?
No, it's yeah, good choice of words. I mean, they never really thought about it, so it's not by design. Definitely, they're not trying to dissuade migration. Though there's a World Bank study which shows that it is actually dissuading migration. So it's a very interesting study. They looked at migration along state borders of India. And so imagine three districts, one district. So you're in one district. Now you have one district which happens to be in UP, say it's a hypothetically, Champaran. There's a district neighboring Champaran, which is Bihar, and there's a district neighboring Champaran, but it's in UP. Now, in theory, I mean, broadly you'll find similar migration numbers across these districts. But it turns out in India that you'll find much more migration between Champaran and the district in Bihar than Champaran and the district which is neighbor, but it's on the other state. Why? Because as per the study, people don't want to lose access to intra-state social service. So it's not deliberate. It was always, I think, there. Uh, but why did people not think of portability for all these years? For 70 years, people have not thought of portability. And I think there the answer is that whenever we talked about migration in India, it came from this Gandhian prism that the way to solve India's migration problem, and note these words, right? Migration problem, which means it is a problem. Nobody thought of migration actually as a solution. If people have thought of migration as a problem. And the way to solve this problem is to invest in rural development so that people won't have to leave. And that is, completely misplaced against all the evidence that we have. That is, when people start getting richer, they actually leave farms. That's the evidence that we had from coastal Andhra, from Punjab, and a lot of other places. And so this initial idea was fairly misplaced. And now in the last 20 years, since interstate mobility has picked up so dramatically, the census data of 2011 clearly shows that. I think now successive governments have seen, I think, I've been studying the subject for more than 10 years. There's a researcher, Priya Deshinkar, who started this whole thing on portability of social security back more than 10 years back. She wrote this book, I think, in 2008. And it's only now, this working group report came, I think, in 2017. And it's taken a long time to literally convince, policymakers, bureaucrats across the board that, look, there is value in making people move more, or rather facilitating safe migration, rather than living in a sort of utopian world thinking that nobody's going to move. And so that's why I think now more people are interested in portability. And in India, it seems that you need a crisis to really highlight it. And then we got this crisis this year, where suddenly migration, internal migration, has been on the hotspot after we saw those crazy visuals of people walking back home. And it was clear because people walk back home because simply they could not access so many services back in the cities, apart from the psychological security that one would get back home.
Wow. So yeah, this study that you talked about East Champaran and West Champaran, which are adjacent district, but West Champaran is basically on the border of UP, and the out migration in West Champaran is low. This is something which I didn't know about. So thanks. And then
No, actually,
so you were talking about how.
I just use that as a hypothetical example. Yeah, I don't know if it's actually true, but what this World Bank study shows is, on average, bordering districts across state borders basically show lesser migration than intrastate.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So you also talked about how the government used to, at least a while back, used to see this migration as a problem, quote unquote, and to check this migration problem. There were rural development schemes, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Narega was also a part of, this checking the migration problem and getting people job in their own areas. So I remember you talked about Bihar and Kerala, this comparison as well, and this part from your book kind of fascinated me, and I just wanted to highlight it here. You said that what unites Bihar and Kerala is an extremely high rate of rural population density that simply cannot support enough livelihoods in the agricultural sector. So could you elaborate on that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, you have to see India's population density map. I mean, if you look at India's migration map, and I have it on my website, why are people moving from some place and not? I mean, why are people not moving from Madhya Pradesh? Madhya Pradesh is fairly poor, and there are a lot of districts in Madhya Pradesh which are as poor as in Bihar. Why are they not moving? And in my book, I take two things. They're two critical factors. The most critical factor is population density, right? That is how many people, and you should understand what is density. It is the population on a particular plot of land, but it's important to understand what kind of land, right? That is, it's not just land, it is arable land. That is, we're really talking about meaningful population density. That is, how many, take the numerator as population and denominator as cultivable land. And then you find that even Uttarakhand, which is a hilly state, so if you look at population density of Uttarakhand, you'll say, it's very remote. But Uttarakhand is high on outmigration. But Uttarakhand's population on cultivable area, because if you remove those, forest land and so on, it's fairly high, right? So there's only that much agriculture that can support the population in Uttarakhand. Similar for Bihar and so on. So population dense. So what does this mean? It means that there's in economics there's a concept called surplus labor. So on that, we're saying in Bihar, the population density is something like 1,000 people per square kilometer. I mean, villages in Bihar are huge. The other thing, by the way, which is similar between Bihar and Kerala, is that villages are huge, right? I mean, the average village size, if you look at India, it's much smaller in Madhya Pradesh than say in Bihar and Kerala. Now, you can actually ask me another question. What explains this variation in population density? And for that, you need to go into history, right? And environment, ecology, and stuff like that. But we know that the lower Gangetic Plain has this continuous habitation for literally centuries and centuries. And Kerala has enjoys this wonderful rainfall, and so it's also been devoid of wars and major famines and so on. So over time, population has accumulated, and hence the density is very high in rural areas. Obviously, in cities, by definition, almost urban density is very high. But we're talking of high rural population density. And what that means is, if you see what's happened in the last 100 years, same amount of land, but the population of India has grown by 4 times. Right? If you look at, say, last 120 years. So there's only that much really that agriculture can really support. Right? And that is what we call as a natural pressure, surplus labor, some sort of a pressure for people to leave. And so in a way, migration is a fantastic safety valve. Otherwise, you would have complete anarchy if migration was not there. That's another way to look at it. That is, if suppose one fine day the government of India says Biharis have to stay in Bihar. And in a way, the lockdown did that, right? I mean, once the Shramik train started, a lot of these people came back. Now the Biharis are moving back to the cities, right? But if you actually told them that, no, all of you have to stay only in Bihar, you would actually get more trouble because there's simply not enough jobs to go around to sustain such high population density. And that is why the Gulf is a fantastic safety valve for Kerala and even Bihar now. And so many leading Indian centers are a safety valve for Bihari migrant workers. So it's not migration per se, which is a problem. It is how do we improve the living conditions. So we started from this song, and a lot of the lamentation in the song is about the miserable conditions. And I think one can do so much, to upgrade slums, to make housing conditions so much better and simpler for migrants. We need to invest massively in rental housing. There's so many things that can be done for migrant workers, and that's really the core issue. It's not migration per se, I think, which is the issue. But this thing that you said about problem and so on, I'll give you an example. I gave a NET exam. This there's a famous exam in India called NET, which enables you to teach and so on. And I failed this exam. And the first question of that exam was state the problems of rural to urban migration. And I wrote this long answer saying why it is not a problem. So maybe I failed the exam because of that. But that just goes to show you how the exam paper was set, right? It was not state the advantages and disadvantages, or critically examine rural to urban migration. The question was state the problems associated with rural to urban migration. Nowhere did the question even accept the possibility that maybe it's not a problem, and so on. So I definitely take the view that it is the most inevitable process of development. It has to happen, and the better quality migration that you can support, the faster these transitions can take place. By the way, in Kerala, the migrations are now slowly falling. So you might also want to ask, when do these migrations eventually stop? And it will stop when the pressure on land finally falls. And so that stops when fertility falls. So, Kerala's fertility now has crashed. Bihar's will take another 20, 30 years to reach where Kerala is today. Right? But Kerala has fertility rate has crashed. And that is why now there are, so to speak, fewer people being born in Kerala. And hence the pressure on land is also falling. And so in the coming decades, you'll find that Kerala's out-migration rates will substantially dip. And for Bihar, one will have to wait many generations till that happens. But that will be the natural way how out-migration automatically subside. There's a sort of demographic logic to these transitions.
So when you said rural population density in Kerala, I just wanted to bring this up as well, because quite a lot of new studies, actually what you're calling villages with high population density, quite a lot of these new studies are categorizing those places as cities. An IDFC research showed how Kerala was more than 90% urban per se, because these places be categorized as cities in a different definition of the term.
Yeah, I mean, Kerala is of course unique in terms of its settlement structure. It's like one long city or village, however you look at it. But the broader idea is settlement sizes, right? So you don't have a metropolitan city of the scale of Bangalore. I mean, none of the top 10 cities of India are based in Kerala, right? And that is an issue. I would say Kerala ought to have a top 10 city. It will be a natural magnet for people to go towards. So it has this one long habitation, partly linked with geography, of course. So in that sense, yes, it's quite different from Bihar, which is a sort of plains. So it's a geographic difference. But this whole idea of census towns, reclassification of villages to city, the crux is Kerala has done this transition away from agriculture to non-agriculture. That is why these villages have now been reclassified as towns. Because if you see the definition of what is a town in India, a census town in particular, it has to meet three definitions. It has to meet, so it has to have something like 5,000 people, a settlement. It has to have a density of, I think, 400 people per square kilometer. On those two definitions, by the way, virtually all of Bihar, and all of Kerala would be urban. It's the third criteria. More than 75% of the male working population should be in non-agricultural activities. And it's that definition which has tipped the scales now for a lot of settlements in Kerala to be reclassified as census towns. And that is why we found this bizarre thing where Kerala's urbanization rate went up from 25% or so to 50% between 2001 and 11. Now, you'll find a very similar thing happening in Bihar, by the way. Bihar's urbanization rate has been stuck at 10% for decades. Bihar will one fine day become 50% urban. But it is not going to happen today. It is not going to happen tomorrow. It is not going to happen next decade. It is likely to happen in 2050s or 60s based on my projection. Why? Because the percentage of population in non-agricultural activities in Bihar is not nowhere close to 75%. It's going to take decades to reach there. Right? So there is a time lag between Bihar and Kerala on the development scale. and hence out-migration rates from Kerala will start subsiding much sooner. So this is what the theory would predict, and I clearly accept this theory. And if you have this podcast 40 years down the line, we can then compare notes. What we basically see is Bihar's out-migration rate still to be fairly high, hopefully of much better quality, and Kerala's out-migration rates to have been practically nil.
So you mentioned the point of replacement rate indirectly, right? So
Yeah.
given that India is also reaching a replacement rate, or actually has, I think, fallen below replacement rate. Do you think that that would impact total net immigration into India?
So are we talking about internal or international migration?
International.
Yeah, so broadly, so India's fertility decline, of course, it has massive regional variations. So it's falling less slower in Bihar and so on. It's fallen much faster in South India. Let me put it this way. Actually, there could be international ramifications, but let's look at it this way. Internally, we know what's happening. There's a massive north to south migration which has already started and it's going to intensify. And this fertility decline, which has happened faster in South India than North India, is drawing in now more migrants from North India to South India, right? Because like we see in Europe,
Yes.
so what happens with fertility decline is that society starts aging, and the average age of that population goes up and up. And what happens then is you also need a lot of people to take care of the elderly, right? And so that is why Europe is now such an old, aged society. They need a young population to sustain its economy, and that is why they are open to immigration from certain places. Similarly, in India, what we're going to see in the next 20, 30 years is more and more north to south migration. Now, when you talk of international migration, yes, the pressure to move out of India will reduce, for example, from Kerala, but it is very region specific. So, where are people moving out of India from? From Punjab, from Kerala, from Goa? And yes, all these places are getting richer, fertility is falling, and so the pressure to move out of India is definitely falling. But what's happening with immigration? Right? And here's the twist: India's biggest, immigrant country. I mean, people coming to India is from Bangladesh, and it's always in the news. But if you've been following the news for the last 1 week, you would know that Bangladesh has done phenomenally well in the last decade. And so, if you look at fertility, fertility rate in Bangladesh is now lower than in India. It was not the case 50 years back. So they've made tremendous strides in the last, this. And what theory would predict is that all this historic immigration from Bangladesh to India is pretty much ancient history, in the sense it could well be the case that in a few decades from now, you have Indians moving to Bangladesh instead of vice versa.
Yes, and in fact,
So Chinmay,
go ahead, Akash.
I think it's a great time to start a guest worker program with Bangladesh so that Indians can go
As long
and
as,
work.
as long as they don't
And
call us, as long as they don't call us termites. Yeah.
Yes. So
Because that was what one of our ministers called Bangladeshi immigrants. So yeah.
yes.
yeah, indeed, and it was in relations with Bangladesh, which is one of our most friendly neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing about Bangladesh came into news last year. This whole CA and RC, and I wrote a huge essay in Mint, the long essay piece in Mint on this particular issue, arguing that whatever concerns there are on immigration from Bangladesh, the fact is that it is falling. The immigration rate was very low to start with at an all India level. Of course, it's fairly intense in few districts along the border of Bangladesh. Yes, immigration is a huge. It has made massive demographic changes and so on. That's absolutely clear. But at an all India rate, it's less than 0.5%, the immigration rate, and it's falling. So I made this argument that, in fact, also saying that maybe in future it might change. But what the latest data is showing is very clear, and the Bangladeshis themselves are not. Their key destination is no longer India. They go to the Gulf, they go to Europe. So there's a huge diversification of immigration from Bangladesh away from India. So that story is very real. So there's a lot of rhetoric, on migration, whether it's from Bihar to Bombay. That's how we started this discussion from the song. There's a political pushback. Bangladesh to India, political pushback. India to the US, political pushback from the Trump. So every place which is getting migrants historically has been upset about it, and one really needs to be smart enough to see, how migration benefits and do some basic cost benefit kind of analysis to see. And usually most cost benefit analysis would tell you that migration is almost always a win-win situation.
Yeah, so that again brings us to this question about nativism and Bal Thackeray in Bombay, and how this sons of the soil sentiment is stoked to and saying that migrants steal your jobs. So could you tell us what data says about migrants stealing the jobs of the native population, especially in the context of say Mumbai?
I mean, there is no data in the sense that government has never done a study on it. But we know that labor market in India is highly segmented, right? In the sense that certain sectors and jobs are completely driven by a particular caste community or a migrant network. So, for example, take cab drivers in Bombay, huge UP, Bihar, in many eastern UP sort of network. Now, do the Maharashtrians want to drive cabs? It turns out not so much. They're interested in higher value jobs. Right? So the demand for local Maharashtrian jobs is kind of different than what these guys are doing. This is what you see across the world. That is all the political rhetoric. For example, Trump on Mexican immigration. It's not that the Americans are going to pick, or do the farm work in Southern America. It's the Mexicans who are going to do that. And so, if you're going to be upset about the Mexicans taking your jobs, the fact is those jobs are not being done by your people. That's a very similar case in the case of Mumbai. Right? And so, what you see is rhetoric, and the rhetoric, of course, works because there's a substantial number of Maharashtrian people who trust political parties saying that they will keep your like Trump, keeping your interests first, sort of thing. So there are two ends to this. Sons of the Soil movement in India has worked in getting votes, but it has never, in my view, actually led to a dent in migration. So, despite the existence of, say, for example, a political party like Shiv Sena in Bombay, Mumbai, which has historically raised questions on migration rates to Bombay, from UPBR have never really dented. There might be the occasional incidents where people go back and so on, or people diversify. I know, one particular person, after some threats, moved from Bombay to Nasik, for example. But these are really sporadic cases. Nothing really has changed on the ground. So there is rhetoric. It helps you win votes, but then nothing is done actually. It's never the case that you kick out the Biharis from Bihar. That has never happened actually in Mumbai, and that is why Mumbai is still, despite all the rhetoric, a terrifically cosmopolitan place. It is India's most cosmopolitan city, and for a good reason. I mean, there's no dominant language in Mumbai. And the best way to see this is to understand, who played the lead character of Bal Thackeray in the film on Bal Thackeray, and it was, a Muslim migrant from Uttar Pradesh, Nawazuddin Siddiqui, who played it. So that just tells you that when it comes to certain things, even people who worship Bal Thackeray will yield to raw talent.
That's so true. So, moving the conversation to the recent COVID crisis and the lockdown, which had a huge impact on migrants, you mentioned that it was an example of poor planning on the government's part. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think there are two concerns. One is, of course, you wake up one fine day, find that this is a seemingly unprecedented situation. You need to lock down, and so you lock down. That is one view, and the government is now claiming that saved thousands and thousands of lives. And I agree in the sense, obviously, a lockdown will save thousands and thousands of lives. But I see the planning very differently. I thought we had time. On 12th or 11th or 12th March, the WHO announced that it was a pandemic. Kerala had already taken steps of curtailing movement before that. There were states in India between 11th and 24th March that did that. And if you remember, government in Madhya Pradesh was changed, or roughly around 18th March. Right? There was a lot of time in which the government could have just arranged special trains and told people to go back home. I mean, they could have done many things if they were determined to. I think they just, if you also see what happened with international travel, the UK government gave the students 1 week notice to go back home. That is, international students to go back home. Our own campus, I don't know what happened at IIT Madras, our own campus shut down, I think on 14th or 15th March, and told students to go back home. Now, were we telling, if you take the government's view, the whole idea was to stop the spread of the virus. Then in a sense, the decision of the IMA was to basically spread the virus in it. But that's not true. The point is, at that point, the virus prevalence was so low, right? In the sense that literally the first two cases also were coming in, that was the perfect time to, if you really want to implement a full lockdown, you need to send back home millions of people who otherwise can't live during a lockdown with no income support, and then announce the lockdown. So that's simply what should have been done. And that's exactly what they did eventually. In the sense, 2 months later, they sent the people back home. Unfortunately, they sent people back home at a time when infection rates were much higher. So it kind of defeated the original purpose. The only argument in favor would be that, by sending people back home 2 months later rather than before, the source regions could ramp up, facilities, quarantine, and so on. But that's not cutting ice. I mean, you you could have had the same thing done. You could have those checks done on railway stations back home, whatever, even 2 months earlier. So on hindsight, now it is good learning that in future, if you want to do something with that, that the people have those Shramik trains run before 24th March. And by the way, they did do that for planes. Some countries where Indians were there, the government of India sent planes before 24th March to get stranded Indians back home. So this is not the case that, and migrants could see that. You could see that, in the week leading up to 24th March, a lot more careful planning was done to shut down air traffic, both international and domestic, vis-a-vis railways, where one fine day you shut down the lifeline of India, which is the Indian Railways, with 4 hours notice. So it was completely on hindsight. I mean, we knew, people who work on migration knew this is a disaster, because people are not going to be able to live in a city. The other problem out here in this crisis was credibility of the deadline. So the government first said 21 days, then it became one more week, one more week. So at a certain point of time, it did not become credible. And so migrants made a very rational choice. They said, look, we don't know how long you have to stay here. Might as well go home. And so that's what they did. So there are many, I think what this incident brings about is many things. One is that a huge part of India cannot really live when your incomes are dried up for literally even a few weeks in cities. That shows you a lot of precarity in working conditions. B, that migrants will also want to go back home because of just this idea of being with your family and so on. And C, precisely because you don't have, this is where game theory kicks in. Game theory has a concept called backward induction. If you don't know how far out you're going to have the lockdown, then you might as well send people back home right away, right? Because then it's not credible. Whatever you announce, the people will be like, okay, 21 days, we'll stay for 21 days. But then now you're saying, no, 10 more days. Sorry, we can't do that. So I think the learning from the episode is that we send back our migrants home before the pandemic. And you believe it or not, this is not the first time this has happened in India. One of my new research interests is pandemics. And so I've been looking at what happened in India in past pandemics. And in 1897, 1896, 97, the plague hit Bombay. The British government, they messed up on a variety of fronts. But they actually did this. They actually set up special trains, like your Shramik trains. They set up special trains to take migrants back home. And the logic was they had to make a decision. They had to make a decision of either shutting down the railways or letting people go back home before announcing certain curbs on movement. And the logic they said was people will anyways go back home. Even if we shut down the railways, they will walk back home. And that was the reasoning they took. And it kind of completely, anticipated what happened in March and April 2020. I can go on this actually. There's another example in China in 1911, when the railways were shut down for third class and fourth class passengers during the Manchurian plague in Northeast China. What did migrants do? They walked back home and they died, in the cold. This happened in Jan 1911. So we have 3 incidents in history. One in which people are allowed to go back home. One in which the railways were shut down and people suffered. And again, we have a situation here when the railways were shut down without planning and people suffered. So unnecessarily, we got a migration crisis. There was absolutely no need for this crisis. And the crisis intensified, of course, potentialities of the virus to develop. So suddenly, if you get 20,000 camps, as per the government's own record, 500,000 people stranded across India. These are perfect sites of density where the virus can thrive, right? And so there were these unnecessary complications that came up.
So basically, we've talked about the pandemic. We've talked about migrants going to these cities, and then some of them moving back. to their places of origins, and then again now going back to the cities because there are no employment opportunities to be found in the places where they come from. Now, one of the stanzas in this song echoes a yearning among migrants for working closer to home, and they lament that it's not possible due to there not being jobs around there. So, given most of India's development is still very concentrated in only a few major cities, do you
Yeah.
think we need more cities?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. I don't think anybody's going to deny that. I think the way I look at it is every state of India should aim to or aspire to have a big city. As simple as that. Uh, it's not the case that you need many cities. I think if each state, I mean, if you see India's development map, the basic problem is that we don't have a big city in the hinterlands encompassing Bihar, Jharkhand, Eastern UP, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh. That circle has no metropolitan city today. They had, by the way, more than 100 years back in relative terms, but today all other cities have moved ahead. And so what you need ideally is Patna to be as big as Bombay. Now, but I'm of the opinion that of a particular logic like this, rather than a completely equi sort of city. I mean, there's also a view that if you had even size cities across the spatial floor, that would be much better. There's a trade-off. Agglomerations have what we call as economies of agglomeration, and nowhere in the world do you get an even sized cities distribution. There's something called the Zipf's law, power law. If you rank cities by population across the world, they go by this particular power law. And so in India, by the way, is one of the outliers. The top two cities are pretty much the same population. Otherwise, the first city is supposed to be twice as big as the second, which is thrice as big as the third, and so on. But in India, Delhi and Bombay are about as big as each other now. So the question, do we need more cities? Of course, we need more cities. But I'm not a fan of, let's develop each and every region of India in the sense that you need to have even size cities and so on. There is something truly spectacular in terms of agglomeration when a city goes past 5 million, say 5 million as a threshold. And so in India today, we have about maybe 10 cities which are past on that threshold. And so we need more such cities. China has done that. But we need that. Ideally, maybe state capitals can become that. How do you do that? You need to invest in particular sectors. So public administration is a classic way. Just have more government jobs, and that is precisely what Tejashwi Yadav is promising now in the Bihar elections. He doesn't have a plan on how to get private sector. So he said, government 10 lakh jobs. That's the going promise right now in the Bihar elections. The other way to do that is to get your own migrants to come back, those who have done successfully, and set up shop and give a lot of incentive to them to work. So yeah, so that's how I see it. So ideally, India's future really relies on Lucknow and Patna becoming as big as Bombay and Bangalore. I'm not a fan of perfect, completely equal development all over. It's never happened. It's not going to happen. But yes, India does have a problem. That is, we don't have a major city in eastern India, and even Kolkata is pretty much in stagnant. It's literally stagnating. So we do need at least one or two big cities coming up between Delhi and Kolkata. But beyond that, not so much. I'm not a votary of perfect regional development.
Yeah, so I think that this fascination with even perfect cities, leave alone perfect regional and balanced development, but even perfect cities, planned cities, I think is misplaced. But having said that, I think Patna, from my personal experience, is a city which is beyond redemption. I don't know how you can redeem Patna. It's really messed up. So that said, I think we do need greenfield cities, but maybe if the government does not have the finances to build a city, we could look at public-private partnerships, or like China did, like
Yeah.
spatial economic zones in Shenzhen. They gave way to cities. Now we could have a spatial jurisdiction in some parts of the country, like like Dubai has a spatial jurisdiction, which is different from the rest of United Arab Emirates,
Yeah.
and that helped the city
Yeah. Yeah.
develop, and that helped.
Special enclaves, charter cities. I think that what one really needs to understand is the biggest reform we need at the urban governance or urban cities issues. Our cities can't do anything because they don't have autonomy in governance and finance, right? And so, in fact, what I feel is you will start getting great cities in India only when they are literally completely devolved of state governments. And so I'm complete votary that some of our biggest cities should be made completely independent, both in functioning and finance. Because no, I mean, no, but I mean, this is the classic thing, right? I mean, Indians are more likely to know the mayor of Bloomberg, mayor of New York, and the mayor of London, right? Rather than the mayor or municipal commissioner of Bombay or Patna. I mean, who knows the municipal commissioner of the city we are living in? Nobody, right? And that's the fact. That's the unfortunate fact in India. We have no investment in our own cities because we simply don't know who's running it. Right? And for us, our political,
Besides,
Hmm. Yeah,
Chennai hasn't had a mayor for so many years, but
yeah,
nobody cares because mayors do not have
Yep.
much authority. I mean, other than changing the street bulbs, I guess, or
yeah,
doing one or two things here and there, they
yeah.
don't really have much
And when
authority.
they have done good, they've remembered. The famous few mayors. I by the way have a project on this, so I know some of the famous guys now, and they've been well respected when they've done good for their cities. But I'm not as pessimistic as you because one of the things I do is read history, and you'll be surprised to know cities like London, Paris, New York. If you go there today, you will like them, and people out there who live there also mostly like them. They were written off, 100 years back as well, as being beyond redemption. So maybe you will be the next mayor of Patna and do wonders for it.
Well, that would happen if there is a direct election, right? I mean, right now, basically, people who are in offices are people who are, put there by the political masters, people who have, people who really don't have a following in the city.
True,
And
true,
that's also, again, connected to the fact that they don't have much authority anyway. And the
Mm.
cities are run by the bureaucrats who are appointed by the state government
that's true.
or
So,
by,
so,
the
so let me
politicians.
rephrase. Maybe you'll be the next chief minister of Bihar and make Patna the greatest city of India. But why not? I feel you should aspire. Yeah.
Well,
He has been
definitely.
contemplating politics though.
Good, good. I think I encourage more and more people from the IIT-IM system to join. My full blessings.
Not immediately, though. Not immediately.
Yeah. First, you will come to IIM, then you will sell soaps, then you will make money, then you will go into politics.
So let's end with this note, because I really like this sentence in your book. If humankind survives till the 22nd century and the map of internal and international economic inequalities gets redrawn, would there be political parties in Bihar that shun Maharashtrian migrants or Indian A1 visas rationed out to Americans?
Yeah, I mean that would be quite the day, right? I mean, can you imagine, Marathi song saying "Patna mein kaya hai," something like that. A rap song on what's there in Patna. I think that would be pretty cool. Quite a nice role reversal.
Right.
Which would be pretty cool. Apparently there is a Kannadiga movie, so Karnataka, yeah, on something. It's like a sci-fi or set in the future, and my cousin was telling me about it. And where there's some sort of a futuristic thing where India's surpassed all nations and so on, and there's an American beggar on the Indian streets. So apparently there is a movie which has a plot line just as what you described. That is, somewhere in the future
Yes.
where there's a complete where American immigrants in India which are clamoring for Indian jobs.
Yeah, yeah. So that video went viral on Facebook and Instagram a while back.
Yeah.
Of yeah, I think it was from the same movie.
Yeah, could be.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I
But
mean,
yeah, role
um,
reversals do happen. And let me tell you that the most famous role reversal in history, which is by the way in chapter 1 of the book, is Bihar itself. Right? We think of Nalanda, right? When you look at a much wider time scale, there were people literally from around the world coming to Bihar and going back. And unfortunately, this is also an open question. When did this role reversal happen? But this role reversal, of course, can always happen back. So Bihar is a great example where people did go actually in the past for learning and a lot of things on a much more historical time scale. And unfortunately, it's kind of reversed. Maybe I mean, the evidence we have is of last 3 centuries. Maybe I don't know how much before that, but definitely
So
3 centuries has knocked it out a little bit. But it'll come back.
yeah, that reminds me of this. That reminds me of this quote from Rajendra Prasad, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who was the first president of India. And this quote is there in Bihar Museum as soon as you enter it, and it's actually one of the best museums that I have come across in India. The Nitish Kumar government just built it, I think, 2 years back. And so when you cross the gate, it says, and this quote I read: India's history for so many centuries is Bihar's history writ large.
Yeah, I mean, look at religions and look at so many things, civilizations and so on. A huge history, yeah. But of course, I mean, a deeper sort of appreciation of history would also tell you Tamil Nadu actually, both Bihar and Tamil Nadu, because Tamil Nadu, that
Definitely.
empire extended across Southeast Asia and so on, Cholas and so on. So yeah, so these two definitely were major regions of Indian history. So to speak.
Definitely. So let's end with this note that, I mean, I'm not really hoping or wishing for a role reversal per se, but what I wish for is a more
Definitely, yeah.
cosmopolitan world. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, a world where, there is more migration, and most of it is basically by choice. And, people. Also, another thing that I feel is that when and there are a world where there are more cities, because I feel that the extent of market in a city is much larger than in a village or a rural settlement. And what that does is that it enables a better standard of living.
Yeah.
So let's hope for a more cosmopolitan world, and let's end this episode on this note. Thanks a lot, Professor Tumbe, for coming, and
Yeah.
it
Great.
was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thanks a lot, Akash and Ruchir.